Hello, everyone. I just wanted to pop in and talk a little bit about culture and gender. So, this week we're talking about culture and gender and the aspects of culture and gender, which we often talk about sex and gender stereotypes, conformity, marriage, sexuality, jealousy, division of labor, femininity, masculinity, all these things kind of encompass when we talk about culture and gender. So, sex and gender, when we talk about sex and gender, we want to talk about sex being the physical characteristics and differences between men and women. And sex roles and sex identity are the behaviors that men and women engage in that are due to their biological differences in the process of reproduction. Sexual identity, however, is a degree of awareness and recognition of an individual of their sex and sex roles. So there has been a lot of discussion about identity, sexual identity, gender identity, uh, in recent times, and how people identify themselves, and how some cultures are more fluid in their sexual identity and gender identity, and more accepting as well. Gender is behaviors that culture deems appropriate for men and women. We have gender roles, gender identity, gender stereotypes. And like I said, gender identity has been in the forefront, especially here in North America, and people reflecting who they are based upon how they recognize themselves, how they adopt in their particular gender role. And that's what gender identity is, the degree into which a person has awareness of or recognition that he or she adopts a particular gender role. Now, we also have gender stereotypes that when we talk about stereotypes in general, we're often referring to things that seem to ring true about the groups of individuals we're talking about, but they're usually created out of narrow ideas about what those individuals or groups of individuals are about. And gender stereotypes are psychological or behavioral characteristics associated with men and women. Now, we talk about gender roles, especially with culture. Gender roles can be very important depending on what culture that you're in. I was most recently watching a video on YouTube about women being mechanics in the southern part of Africa, South Africa, um, various countries near South Africa, Namibia, Malawi, those particularly areas, which has been a male dominant or male specific gender role in the culture, and some of the barriers for these women mechanics have been the stereotypes that men have about what women should do in their society. So we see that quite often reflected when we talk and when we infuse culture and we move around the world and we look at what gender roles and what's gender specific to masculinity and femininity in that particular culture. So, what are gender differences across cultures? We talk about, oftentimes research talks about the level of masculinity and femininity that's displayed in a particular culture and how that is reflected. And we talk about low and high masculine societies concerning sexuality and religion. Sexuality and religion seem to fall hand in hand oftentimes in these discussions. We know religion plays a significant role, especially in traditional cultures that have been colonized, and religious doctrine has been introduced into indigenous cultures, and also the idea of masculinity. Now, you have to also think about a lot of concepts that have been introduced to disrupt culture, have been introduced by cultures that are seen as dominant cultures, having a specific ideology that needs to be passed and put into the world. So, if we talk about low and high masculinities in sexual behavior, this can be reflected in how public health is created, especially around HIV and AIDS. If we look at HIV and AIDS in particular cultures, and we can look in South Africa, for instance, where some of the misconceptions about how HIV was transmitted early on was grounded in kind of these gender role stereotypes, and some of them are still held on to today. Even here in North America and the Americas, in terms of sexually transmitted diseases and the taboos around sexuality. Your generation has grown up with these kinds of sexual transmitted diseases and knowledge about them, but even yet, I think sex education as a whole around the world in general is lacking in the understanding of what sexuality, sex educations, gender role stereotypes, sexual role stereotypes are about. Talking about sex and sexuality can be taboo in many cultures. Um, Understanding reproduction and the taboos around reproduction as well, and even talking about menses and menstruation in cultures is considered taboo, and women are prohibited from participating in religious ceremonies, entering religious monuments and churches, mosques, etc., depending on what the cultural taboo around what sex and sexuality and reproduction is about. We also talk about low masculinity, high masculinity in terms of the orientation around sex and who should be who intimate with whom, how the media portrays it. You know, we've had, if we go to India, for instance, we have seen women being killed based upon honor killings. We see that in the Middle East as well, in Middle Eastern countries as well, where women have seen to be adulterous or having sex out of marriage and being killed for breaking that particular taboo. We talk about how religion also can maintain these stereotypes around what they are, what sex is, and the roles of men and women in sexuality. We have countries around the world who have been talking about homosexuality, and there are quite a few countries around the world that have outlawed homosexuality, and it can be punishable by death and punishable by long jail sentences as well. So let's talk about sex and sexuality and how the cultural differences exist in the degree and the importance placed on the values of womanhood in women. We talk about traditional cultures, conservative cultures that view chastity and virtue of unmarried women being the hallmark and the importance of moving to the next step, even a rite of passage. In other cultures, may have open and explicit talks and actions around sex and approval of sexual partners even before marriage. Even the idea of homosexuality it swings the pendulum of being outlawed completely, can lead to a death sentence, to being encouraged in a community and supported in a community in the forms of looking at gender more fluidly. If we think of Mahu and Fafafini and the role of Fafafini in a society, even in India and Thailand, there are gender categories that are listed in the census that are beyond the usual male and female designation. So cultures with limited resources and stressful environments are usually associated with insecure romantic attachments and high fertility rates. one of the issues that happened during the pandemic was children, young girls and boys were taken out of schools in countries. In particular, Uganda, kids didn't go to school for 2 years. There was no educational processes going in school for 2 years. A lot of countries in Africa also send their children away to school, like to boarding schools, which is seen as in here in the Americas, North Americas, as kind of more of a specific kind of privilege anomaly. But in Africa and African countries, this is kind of the norm that kids go to boarding schools. And since Uganda had such a strict COVID policy about transmission and closed schools, children, like I said, didn't go to school for 2 years. As a result of that, the negative outcome of that is that we saw kids not learning, and then we started seeing a higher rates of child marriages, younger boys and girls, and particularly girls, being more vulnerable in the world, because school oftentimes is a safe haven for children. And so as a result of that, we saw a rise in younger pregnancies, younger girls becoming pregnant and not returning to school when they did institute school back in, which they did most recently. So the cultural differences in attitudes and towards sex are related towards sexual orientation as well, and what is seen as what's appropriate sexual behavior. Um, we often think about our sexual orientation here in the Western world in terms of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, androgynous, queer, transgender, intersex. We have a number of designations that we are recognizing and understanding in our kind of Western ideology of sexual orientation. But when you go to more traditional cultures, especially those that have high religiosity, then the idea of sexual orientation is very binary: heterosexual and homosexual. There's nothing in between. So culture affects the practices of the idea of what is healthy, what deems healthy sexuality, the issues of circumcision, female genital mutilation, which is often referred to as female circumcision. All of these kinds of things are pushed by cultural and religious practices, and cultural practices, especially female genital mutilation, is embedded in a cultural practice that is in the guise of religiosity, but has no standing in those places. Now, we must also be careful to look at these practices in a very non-biased way. Even though we don't agree with the practices, even though the practices have proven to be harmful in terms of medically, they still are embedded in a culture that may have been developed and maintained for many, many years. So anytime we're talking about culture and changing cultural practices, we have to understand the history and the reasoning behind the cultural practices exist, even though we don't practice those cultural practices or even subscribe or believe that they should be in existence. We have to have some level of respect around those kinds of points of view. Okay. When we talk about gender roles and gender culture and gender role stereotypes, we have to understand that gender related stereotypes are universal across cultures. Every culture that you go into and then you bed yourself into or you are exposed to will have some specifics about gender roles, and they often can be seen as stereotypical depending on who is viewing them and depending on what gender role stereotypes of the culture that you're coming from. Okay. Oftentimes, unfortunately, these gender role stereotypes swing the pendulum towards favorability of male and female characteristics, not the fluidity of masculinity and femininity as well. When we talk about gender roles and ethnicities, we have to talk about androgyny, and androgyny has become uh, more in the forefront across cultures. Young people, thanks to your generation, the current generations that is arising, and the fluidity and the acceptance and the less indoctrination of concepts that are been embraced by an older older generation. However, gender identities have some stereotypical aspects to it as well. But when we talk about androgyny, this is around the issue of gender reveal parties. There are a lot of people who hate gender parties because gender is considered kind of this social construct in their mind, in their in terms of identity develops and you learn it. You're not born with your gender identity. You're born with your biological sex, and sometimes you can be born with your biological sex being ambiguous. So there is a you could say there is a what is the word I'm trying to say? I'm stuck for my words here. There is a good reasoning behind why we shouldn't have gender reveal parties and make it about the sex of the infant. We should really be calling them sex reveal parties because we're not revealing gender, because gender is how one identifies as either being male or female or other. So then you also come into the difficulties of if you have a sex reveal party, gender reveal party, and that your baby's born with some difficulties or some challenges. I think we do a lot of things. A lot of these things that we do are for our own satisfaction and not really considering the unborn child and the child that's coming into existence as well. So, think about this. Should we have gender reveal parties, or should we have sex reveal parties, or should we just have baby is coming, we're happy that the baby's coming, and whatever biological sex, male or female, or if they're sexual ambiguous, we're happy that the baby is coming. So let's kind of sum up everything. So gender permeates and shares an important link with our culture. We have gender roles that are different for males and females in all cultures. We have some stereotypical notions about gender differences that are universal across cultures. And studying gender differences in the United States and around the world can be challenging because of our cultural and ethnic diversity. However, all cultures help us define roles and duties and responsibilities that we see are specific to male and females across the board. I think what we should go away with is understanding that this conception, this understanding, this view of what gender and gender roles are is becoming more fluid, and we need to adapt to that fluidity. Thanks for listening, and make sure you like and subscribe this video.